My parents made me pay $50 for every mistake I made, and by age 12, I owed them $487,000. The red ledger sat on the dining room table. I was 5 when my father first opened it and wrote my name at the top, Adrian Castellano. Below that, the first entry, spilled juice on carpet, $50. My mother stood behind him with her arms crossed. You need to learn that actions have consequences. Real financial accountability. Every mistake after that went into the ledger. Forgot to make my bed, $50. Talked back, $50. Got a B-, $50. Left my backpack in the hallway, $50. By age 6, I owed $3,400. Every Sunday evening was ledger review. My father would open the book and make me read each entry aloud while he calculated the running total plus 8% compound interest annually. This is how the real world works, he'd say. Mistakes cost money. You're learning young. By age 8, I owed $47,000. By 10, $198,000. By 12, $487,000. I started noticing discrepancies when I turned 13. Entries for dates I wasn't even home. Broken items I'd never touched. Conversations I didn't remember having. One entry read, made mother cry with disrespectful tone. $50 March 15th. I was at a school field trip that entire day. I brought it up during ledger review. My father adjusted his glasses and looked at me calmly. We've started recording anticipated mistakes based on statistical probability. Teenagers lie and hide things. We're calculating what you've likely done but haven't admitted to. My mother nodded. It's predictive accounting. Very advanced. I stared at them. You're charging me for things I didn't do? My father made a note in the ledger. Questioning parental authority. $50. I watched him write it, the pen scratching across paper, adding another $50 to a debt I'd never escape. The entries got stranger. $50. Wasted father's time with stupid question about homework. $50. Existed selfishly during parents' anniversary dinner. $50. Breathed too loudly during family movie night. I started documenting everything I did, keeping my own journal with times and dates, witnesses, proof I wasn't making the mistakes they claimed. During the next ledger review, I presented my evidence. My father glanced at my notebook and pushed it aside. Your records are irrelevant. This ledger is the official family document. It's been notarized by our attorney. He flipped to the back page where a legal stamp sat embossed in gold. Any challenge to its accuracy results in a $500 penalty for insubordination. My mother smiled. We're doing this because we love you. Someday you'll thank us for teaching you real accountability. I looked at that gold stamp and felt something die inside me. They'd made it legal. They'd made it permanent. My friends at school started noticing changes in me. I stopped joining them for lunch because I couldn't afford to buy food with money that wasn't mine. Everything I had technically belonged to my parents, applied against my debt. When someone offered to buy me a slice of pizza, I'd panic, calculating whether accepting it would somehow add to what I owed. My best friend Connor asked why I was always so anxious. I tried to explain the ledger system, but halfway through I saw his face change from concern to disbelief. That's insane, he said. That can't be legal. But I'd seen the notarized stamp. I'd seen the official-looking documents. I believed it was real because my parents were accountants, professionals who understood money and law in ways I never could. Connor suggested I talk to the school counselor. I told him I couldn't. Speaking to outsiders about family finances, $200 would go in the ledger. I'd seen that entry before. I turned 15 in September. That's when they announced the payment plan. My father called me into his home office where he and my mother sat behind their matching desks, the ledger open between them. You're old enough to work now. We've arranged a position for you at our firm. 20 hours per week at minimum wage. Your paychecks will be direct deposited to us and applied to your debt. I did the math in my head. $400 per month against $487,000 plus compounding interest. Over 100 years to pay it off. That's impossible. I can't pay that off in my lifetime. My father slid a document across the desk. That's why we've structured it as a multi-generational debt. Your children will inherit the balance. I stared at the paper. My signature was already on it, dated from when I was 7 years old. I never signed this. My mother's voice was cold. You did. We have video evidence, and our attorney has assured us it's legally binding. The document outlined everything. Refusal to work added $5,000 as a breach of contract fee. Any attempt to seek outside employment without their permission added $10,000 for violation of exclusivity clause. Speaking to relatives about the debt added $2,000 per incident for defamation. Attempting to leave home before age 18 added $50,000 for breach of family contract plus immediate legal action. My parents had thought of everything. What if I just refuse? I asked. What if I don't pay? My father pulled out another folder. Inside were liens they'd filed against my future earnings, legal documents claiming ownership of any inheritance I might receive, and a lawsuit they'd already drafted against me for the full amount plus emotional damages for my ungrateful attitude. Everything was signed by a lawyer named Gerald Brubaker. Everything looked official. Everything looked real. I was 15 years old, and according to these documents, I would never be free. I started working at their accounting firm the following Monday. They set me up in a windowless storage room in the basement, filing old tax returns and shredding documents. Every Friday, my supervisor handed me a paycheck. Every Friday, my father took it before I could even open the envelope. "Applied to your debt," he'd say, making a note in the ledger. After 6 months of working, my debt had grown to $512,000. The interest was accumulating faster than my payments. I mentioned this during ledger review. "Perhaps you should work harder," my mother said. "Request overtime. Show some initiative." But when I asked my supervisor about overtime, he looked confused. "Your parents specifically instructed maximum 20 hours per week. They said you needed time for schoolwork." I realized they'd designed a system I couldn't win. The debt would grow forever, always expanding faster than I could possibly pay. My supervisor at the firm was a woman named Linda Chen, who'd worked with my parents for 15 years. She started noticing things: how I never ate lunch, how I flinched when someone mentioned money, how I looked exhausted every Friday when I handed over my paycheck. One afternoon, she pulled me aside. "Adrian, where is your paycheck money actually going? You're a minor. Your parents shouldn't be taking your earnings." I explained the debt system, the ledger, the contracts. Linda's face went through several expressions before settling on anger. "That's not legal. Children can't enter binding debt agreements. Your parents know that. They're accountants. They know exactly what they're doing." She asked if she could see the contracts. I was terrified of the $2,000 defamation fee, but something in Linda's voice made me trust her. I brought the documents the next day. She read through them during lunch, her jaw getting tighter with each page. "This is fraud," she said. "Gerald Brubaker isn't even a licensed attorney anymore. He was disbarred years ago." Linda did something my parents never expected. She reported them to the State Labor Board for wage theft and to Child Protective Services for financial abuse. The investigation started immediately. CPS showed up at my house on a Wednesday morning while I was at school. My father called me in a rage. "What have you done? What lies have you been spreading?" 2 social workers were in the background asking questions. My mother was crying. When I got home that afternoon, both my parents were waiting in the living room with faces I'd never seen before. Not angry, terrified. My father's hands were shaking as he held the red ledger. "We can fix this," he said. "We'll remove the debt. We'll tear up the contracts. We'll explain to the investigators that this was a misunderstanding, an educational exercise that got out of hand." My mother reached for my hand. "We never meant to hurt you. We were trying to teach you responsibility. It's a lesson, Adrian. Just a lesson." I pulled my hand away. "You destroyed 10 years of my life for a lesson?" The social workers wanted to speak with me privately. They took me to a conference room downtown and asked questions for 3 hours. I told them everything. About the ledger that started when I was 5. About the entries for mistakes I never made. About the predictive accounting and statistical probability. About the forged contracts and fake attorney. About working at the firm and never seeing a penny of my earnings. About the multi-generational debt designed to trap my future children. The lead investigator was a man in his 50s named Robert Hayes, who'd been doing this work for 20 years. He looked at my documentation with something like horror. "I've seen financial abuse cases before," he said, "but never anything this systematic. Your parents built an entire infrastructure to exploit you." He asked if I had siblings. I thought of my younger sister Melanie, just 8 years old. That's when I remembered. Melanie had her own ledger now. They'd started it 6 months ago on her 8th birthday. I told Robert Hayes, and his face went dark. "We need to move fast." They pulled Melanie from school that afternoon and brought her to the same conference room. She was small for her age, with our mother's dark hair and our father's anxious eyes. When they asked her about the ledger, she started crying. "I owe $900, she said. "Daddy says I have to be more careful. I make too many mistakes." The social worker asked what kind of mistakes. Melanie pulled out a piece of paper from her backpack where she'd written them all down, trying to memorize them so she wouldn't repeat them. "Forgot to say please. $50. Laughed too loud at dinner. $50. Asked for dessert before finishing vegetables. $50. Cried when I got in trouble. $100. That last one made Robert Hayes close his eyes. "They're charging her for crying?" he asked me. I nodded. "Emotional manipulation. $100. It's a frequent entry. They placed us in emergency foster care that night. We stayed with a family named the Kowalskis, who had 3 other foster kids, and a house that felt chaotic and warm, and nothing like the cold precision of our parents' home. Melanie clung to me the first few days, terrified she was making mistakes that someone was writing down. She'd apologize for everything, for breathing too loud, for taking too long in the bathroom, for asking questions. Mrs. Kowalski noticed and sat down with both of us after dinner on the 3rd night. "There's no ledger here," she said gently. "There's no debt. You're children. You're supposed to make mistakes. That's how you learn." Melanie looked at me to see if this was true. I didn't know what to tell her. I'd lived under the ledger system for so long that the idea of life without it felt like a trap, like they were lying to us, and the real accounting would come later. Child Protective Services moved quickly once they understood the scope of the abuse. They referred our case to the district attorney's office, which opened a criminal investigation. A prosecutor named Angela Reeves was assigned. She was in her 40s, had prosecuted financial crimes for 15 years, and when she read through our case files, she told me later she'd gone home and cried. "Your parents didn't just abuse you," she said. "They built a machine designed to crush you systematically over decades. This wasn't discipline. This was torture. She filed charges: 2 counts of child abuse, multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of minors. My parents hired a defense attorney named Philip Sutton, who immediately went on the offensive. He argued that the ledger system was an unorthodox but legal parenting technique, that my parents never intended to actually collect the debt, that it was theoretical, educational, a way to teach responsibility without real financial impact. But Angela Reeves was thorough. She subpoenaed my parents' bank records and found the account where they'd been depositing my paychecks. Every cent I'd earned over 6 months, never touched, sitting in an account labeled Adrian Debt Repayment. She found emails between my parents discussing the system. One email from my mother to my father read, "Adrian's debt is now large enough that he'll never question leaving. The psychological impact of the numbers is working exactly as planned." Another email discussed Melanie. "Starting her ledger younger will normalize the system faster. By age 12, she won't remember life without it." Angela showed me these emails during trial preparation. "Your parents knew exactly what they were doing," she said. "This wasn't about education. This was about control." Reading those emails, seeing my mother discuss my psychological manipulation like a science experiment, something broke open inside me that I didn't know how to fix. The preliminary hearing happened in November. The judge reviewed the evidence and ruled there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial. My parents' attorney argued for bail, claiming they weren't flight risks and had ties to the community. Angela argued they'd been systematically abusing their children for a decade and had already demonstrated willingness to forge legal documents. The judge set bail at $100,000 each. My father's sister posted their bail, and they were released pending trial. The conditions included no contact with me or Melanie, GPS monitoring, and weekly check-ins with a probation officer. That night, my father violated the no-contact order by sending me an email. "Adrian, please understand we never meant to hurt you. The system got away from us. We love you. We just wanted you to be responsible." I forwarded the email to Angela Reeves, who immediately filed a motion to revoke bail. The judge gave my parents one warning. Any further violation meant jail until trial. Living with the Kowalskis, I started to see how abnormal my childhood had been. Their kids spilled things at dinner and nobody wrote it down. They forgot chores and got gentle reminders, not financial penalties. They talked back sometimes and got sent to their rooms for an hour, not charged $50 plus interest. I watched this unfold like I was studying a foreign culture. Melanie adapted faster. She was younger, had lived under the system for less time. Within a month, she was laughing at dinner without flinching, asking for seconds without calculating the cost. But I couldn't shake the math. Every action still translated into dollars in my head. Slept late on Saturday, $50. Forgot to do homework, $50. Broke a glass washing dishes, $50. Mrs. Kowalski caught me one evening sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down my mistakes and calculating what I owed. She gently took the notebook away. "Adrian, you don't owe us anything. Please try to believe that." The trial started in February, 4 months after Melanie and I were removed from our parents' home. The courtroom was cold and formal, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. My parents sat at the defense table in clothes I'd never seen them wear, trying to look like normal people instead of the calculating machines they'd become. The prosecution called witnesses systematically. Linda Chen testified about the working conditions at the firm, how I'd been isolated in the basement, how my paychecks had been immediately confiscated. Robert Hayes from CPS testified about finding us, about Melanie's list of mistakes she'd memorized, about the documentation of systematic abuse. Financial experts testified about the fraudulent contracts and fake attorney. A psychologist testified about the long-term effects of financial abuse on children, describing how it creates learned helplessness, anxiety disorders, and a distorted sense of self-worth. She said children raised in these systems often struggle with basic decision-making as adults because they've been taught their judgment is worthless. Then it was my turn to testify. Angela Reeves walked me through my entire childhood, the first entry in the ledger when I was 5, the Sunday evening reviews where I had to read my mistakes aloud, the predictive accounting where they charged me for things I didn't do, the fake contracts and forged signatures, working in the basement and never seeing my earnings, the fear that had governed every action for 10 years. "Adrian," Angela asked, "did you ever believe you'd be free of this debt?" I looked at my parents. My father was staring at the table. My mother was crying silently. "No," I said. "I thought I'd be paying it off my whole life, and then my children would have to pay it. That's what the contract said." Angela showed me the document claiming multi-generational debt. "Did you understand what this meant when you supposedly signed it at age 7? I shook my head. I was 7. I didn't understand debt or contracts or any of it. I just knew my parents said I owed them money and I had to pay it back. The jury was watching me with expressions I couldn't read. Philip Sutton, the defense attorney, cross-examined me next. He tried to make it seem like the ledger system had some merit, that my parents had just taken a reasonable idea too far. "Isn't it true that your parents never physically harmed you?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but they destroyed me in every other way." He asked if my parents had provided food, shelter, clothing, and education. I said yes. He asked if I'd ever been left without basic necessities. I wanted to say that emotional safety was a basic necessity, that living in constant fear of accumulating debt was a form of starvation, but I just said no. He was trying to paint them as misguided parents, not abusers. But then he made a mistake. He asked, "Did your parents ever tell you they loved you?" I looked at him directly. Every Sunday during ledger review, right before they calculated my compound interest and told me I'd never pay off what I owed them. They'd say they were doing this because they loved me, that someday I'd thank them. Melanie testified next. She was 9 years old, small in the witness box, speaking into a microphone that had to be lowered to reach her. Angela asked her gentle questions about her ledger, about what she'd been taught to believe about mistakes. Melanie explained that she thought all kids had ledgers, that it was normal to owe your parents money for making mistakes. "When did you realize it wasn't normal?" Angela asked. Melanie thought about it. "When Mrs. Kowalski let me have a second cookie without writing anything down. I waited for her to get the ledger, but she just smiled and said, I could have another if I wanted. I asked how much that cost and she looked confused. That's when I knew something was different." The jury was watching Melanie with visible emotion now. One woman was wiping her eyes. Philip Sutton declined to cross-examine Melanie, probably recognizing that questioning a 9-year-old abuse victim would make his clients look worse. Melanie stepped down and sat next to me in the gallery, grabbing my hand. "Did I do okay?" she whispered. I told her she did perfectly. The defense case was weak. Philip Sutton called character witnesses who testified that my parents were respected accountants, involved in community organizations, seemed like dedicated parents from the outside. He called a psychologist who argued that unconventional parenting methods weren't necessarily abusive if the intent was educational. But under cross-examination, Angela demolished him. She asked if charging a 5-year-old child $50 for spilling juice had any educational value. The psychologist hesitated. "It depends on the implementation." Angela showed him entries from the ledger. "Existed selfishly during anniversary dinner, $50. Breathed too loudly during movie night, $50. She asked if these had educational value. The psychologist admitted they did not. She asked if forcing a child to work and confiscating their entire paycheck constituted educational practice. He said no. By the time Angela was done, the defense's expert witness had essentially confirmed the prosecution's case. My parents didn't testify. Philip Sutton advised against it, knowing Angela would destroy them on the stand. Closing arguments took a full day. Angela Reeves stood before the jury and described 10 years of calculated abuse disguised as discipline. She walked them through the ledger entries, the fraudulent contracts, the stolen wages, the psychological manipulation. "The defense wants you to believe this was about education, about teaching responsibility," she said. "But ask yourselves, what were these children actually learning? They were learning that their existence was a burden, that every action had a price, that they would never, ever be free of the debt they supposedly owed for being born. They were learning that their parents' love was conditional on perfect behavior and financial repayment. That's not education. That's systematic destruction of a child's sense of worth." She pointed at my parents. These defendants built a machine designed to crush their children slowly over decades. They documented it meticulously. They enforced it consistently. They even tried to make it legal with fake contracts and a disbarred attorney. This wasn't poor judgment. This was calculated, purposeful abuse, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Philip Sutton's closing argument tried to humanize my parents. He talked about how they'd been raised by strict parents themselves, how they genuinely believed they were teaching valuable lessons, how they'd lost perspective but never intended real harm. Yes, their methods were unorthodox, he admitted. Yes, they took things too far, but these are not evil people. These are parents who made mistakes while trying to raise responsible children. They got caught up in a system of their own creation and didn't know how to stop it. They are guilty of bad judgment, perhaps, but not criminal abuse. They never physically harmed their children. They provided food, shelter, education, everything children need. The ledger system, while misguided, was meant to teach, not to torture. He asked the jury to consider their intent, their lack of criminal history, their genuine remorse. But he couldn't explain away the emails discussing psychological manipulation. He couldn't explain the stolen paychecks or the fake legal documents. His closing felt hollow against the weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. Melanie and I waited in a victim advocacy room with Mrs. Kowalski and Angela Reeves, trying to distract ourselves with card games and books. But I couldn't focus. My entire future depended on 12 strangers deciding whether what my parents did was criminal or just unconventional parenting. On the second afternoon, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. My parents sat rigid at the defense table, holding hands. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. Count 1, child abuse of Adrian Castellano, guilty. Count 2, child abuse of Melanie Castellano, guilty. Count 3, fraud, guilty. Count 4, forgery, guilty. Count 5 through 8, financial exploitation of minors, guilty on all counts. My mother collapsed forward, sobbing. My father stared straight ahead, his face completely blank. I felt Melanie grab my hand and squeeze. We'd won. They'd believed us. The system had worked. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Diane Porter, who'd reviewed every page of the ledgers, every fraudulent contract, every email discussing psychological manipulation. She asked my parents if they wanted to make a statement before sentencing. My father stood, his voice shaking. Your Honor, I want to apologize to my children. I lost perspective. I let my obsession with teaching accountability become something dark and twisted that hurt the people I love most. I thought I was preparing them for a harsh world. Instead, I created that harsh world in our home. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He sat down. My mother stood next, could barely speak through crying. I should have stopped it. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop once we'd started. I followed my husband's lead, and I destroyed my children in the process. I'm sorry, Adrian. I'm sorry, Melanie. I failed you completely. Judge Porter listened without expression. Then she spoke. I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've seen many cases of child abuse, each heartbreaking in its own way. But this case is unique in its systematic cruelty. You didn't abuse your children in moments of anger or loss of control. You built a detailed system designed to break them psychologically over years. You documented every step. You justified it with the language of responsibility and education. You even tried to make it legal with fraudulent contracts. She looked at my parents directly. You turned your home into a prison where your children's every mistake was weaponized against them. You stole their childhoods and replaced them with fear and impossible debt. You took their wages and called it education. You forged legal documents to trap them indefinitely. And perhaps most disturbing, your emails show you understood exactly what you were doing. You discussed the psychological impact deliberately. This wasn't ignorance. This was calculated abuse. She sentenced them each to 5 years in prison for the criminal charges, with an additional 3 years probation after release. She ordered them to pay $200,000 in restitution to me and $50,000 to Melanie for stolen wages and emotional damages. She terminated their parental rights permanently. My parents appealed immediately. Philip Sutton argued the sentence was too harsh, that they deserved leniency as first-time offenders who'd never physically harmed anyone, that the financial abuse charges were overreach. The appeals process took 8 months. During that time, Melanie and I stayed with the Kowalskis, who'd expressed interest in adopting us if my parents' rights were permanently terminated. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Sarah Kim twice a week to process what she called complex financial trauma. She explained that abuse doesn't have to be physical to be devastating, that what my parents did was a form of psychological torture, that recovery would take years. She taught me grounding techniques for when I started calculating invisible debts. When I bought something and immediately felt guilty, I was supposed to stop, breathe, and remind myself that money was currency, not punishment, that mistakes were learning opportunities, not financial liabilities, that I was allowed to exist without accumulating debt. Some days I could do it. Other days, the ledger math ran in the background of my mind like software I couldn't delete. The appeals court upheld the conviction, but reduced prison time to 3 years, ruling that while the abuse was serious, the sentence was slightly excessive for defendants with no prior record. My parents would be eligible for parole in 18 months with good behavior. Angela Reeves called to tell me the news. I asked what would happen when they got out. The restraining order is permanent, she said. They can never contact you or Melanie again. The restitution stands regardless of their release date. Their names are on the child abuse registry forever. They'll never work with children or in positions of financial trust again. Their accounting firm had already fired them both when the conviction became public. Their professional licenses were suspended permanently. The local news had covered the trial extensively, using phrases like ledger of horrors and debt slavery. My parents had become notorious cautionary tales about how parenting could cross into criminal territory. The Kowalskis officially adopted us when I turned 16 and Melanie was 9. They gave us their last name, Kowalski, legally separating us from the Castellano name that had become synonymous with abuse in our community. The adoption hearing was simple, but emotional. Judge Porter, the same judge who'd sentenced my parents, presided. She asked if we understood what adoption meant, that the Kowalskis would become our legal parents with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Melanie said yes immediately. I hesitated, not because I didn't want it, but because the idea of parents felt dangerous now. Mrs. Kowalski noticed and squeezed my shoulder. No ledgers, she whispered. Ever. I said yes. Judge Porter signed the papers and congratulated the Kowalski family. Walking out of the courthouse with a new last name felt like shedding skin, painful and necessary and strange. High school was difficult. Students knew who I was, had seen the news coverage, had heard their parents discuss the case. Some treated me with awkward pity. Others were curious, asking invasive questions about the ledgers and the trial. A few were cruel, making jokes about owing money or calculating mistake debts. My friend Connor, who'd been with me since middle school, became my shield. When someone made a ledger joke, Connor would shut it down immediately. Not funny, he'd say flatly. Move on. I was grateful for him. Most days I felt like I was performing normalcy, pretending I knew how to be a regular teenager when internally I was still calculating costs and debts. My therapist said this was normal, that deprogramming from systematic abuse took time, that I shouldn't expect to heal linearly. Some days I believed her. Other days I felt permanently broken, Like the ledger had rewritten something fundamental in my brain that couldn't be fixed. Melanie healed faster and more completely than I did. By age 10, she rarely talked about our parents or the ledgers. She made friends easily, joined the school choir, became the kid who was always laughing. Mrs. Kowalski said it was because she'd been younger when we escaped, had less time under the system, had more neuroplasticity to recover. I was happy for her, but also envious. I wanted to forget as easily as she seemed to, but I was 17 with 10 years of conditioning versus her 9 years with only 2 years of conditioning. The math made sense even though I hated it. Dr. Kim reminded me that trauma wasn't a competition, that Melanie's easier recovery didn't invalidate my harder one, that we'd both been hurt and both deserved support. She also said that my protective instinct toward Melanie, my need to shield her from our parents even when they weren't around anymore, was part of my trauma response. I'd become her guardian during the abuse and couldn't turn it off now that we were safe. The restitution money came in installments as my parents' assets were liquidated. Their house sold for $340,000 minus the mortgage payoff and legal fees, leaving about $180,000 split between Melanie and me, according to the court order. Their cars sold, their retirement accounts were drained, everything converted to cash and deposited into trust funds we couldn't access until age 21. Mr. Kowalski, who was a financial advisor, helped me understand what this meant. The money was compensation for the trauma and stolen wages, meant to give us a foundation my parents had tried to destroy, but he warned that no amount of money could replace the years we'd lost or the childhood we'd been denied. I appreciated his honesty. Some people acted like the restitution fixed everything, like money could erase abuse. It couldn't, but it could give me options my parents had tried to eliminate, and that mattered. I graduated high school at 18 with decent grades despite everything. College felt impossible initially, the idea of accumulating student debt triggering panic attacks about owing money. But Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski sat me down and explained that student loans were normal debt, not punishment debt, that millions of students borrowed money for education and paid it back over time, without shame or fear. Dr. Kim worked with me on separating legitimate financial obligations from the abusive ledger system. I applied to state universities and got accepted to several. I chose one 3 hours away, far enough to feel independent but close enough to visit the Kowalskis regularly. Melanie cried when I left for college, worried I'd disappear like our parents had. I promised to call twice a week and visit once a month. I kept that promise. College was where I started rebuilding myself as someone separate from the abuse. My roommate was a guy named Isaiah from Chicago who knew nothing about my past and treated me like a normal person. I didn't tell him about the ledgers or the trial for the entire first semester. He just thought I was a serious student who didn't go to many parties and was weird about money. When I finally told him over winter break, he was quiet for a long time. "That's the most messed up thing I've ever heard," he said eventually. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Then he asked if I wanted to talk about it or never mention it again. I chose never mention it again, and he respected that. Isaiah became my best friend, someone who knew my history but didn't define me by it. He taught me how to be normal adjacent, how to go to a campus event without calculating its cost in mistake increments, how to buy myself coffee without guilt. I majored in social work with a focus on financial abuse and family systems. Everyone assumed I'd go into child protective services, that I'd want to save kids from situations like mine. Instead, I focused my senior thesis on financial abuse in adult relationships, how abusers use money to trap and control partners, how victims are gaslit into believing they owe debts they don't. My professor encouraged me to submit it to a journal, and it was published in the Journal of Family Violence in my junior year. Seeing my name in print, my research out in the world, felt like reclaiming something my parents had tried to destroy. They'd made me feel worthless, told me my existence was a burden, calculated my life in dollars of debt. Now I was producing knowledge, helping others understand these systems, turning my trauma into something useful. Dr. Kim called it post-traumatic growth. I called it survival with purpose. My parents were released from prison after serving 2 years. They'd been model prisoners, completed anger management and parenting courses, participated in therapy programs. The parole board determined they'd shown genuine remorse and weren't a danger to the community. Angela Reeves notified me of their release and reminded me the restraining order was permanent. They couldn't contact me or Melanie, couldn't come within 500 feet of us, couldn't attend any events where we might be present. They moved to a different state and took jobs as tax preparers, positions that didn't require the professional accounting licenses they'd lost. I checked the abuse registry sometimes, seeing their names listed under financial exploitation and child abuse. Part of me wanted them to reach out somehow, to explain what had broken inside them that made them think the ledger system was acceptable, but they never did. Maybe the restraining order prevented it. Maybe they were ashamed. Maybe they'd moved on and built new lives where Melanie and I were just mistakes they'd rather forget. I graduated college at 22 with honors and job offers from 3 different social service agencies. I accepted a position at a nonprofit that specialized in financial literacy and abuse recovery, working with adults who'd been controlled through money. My first client was a woman named Patricia, whose husband had been tracking her spending in a notebook almost identical to my father's ledger. She showed me the entries. Grocery shopping over budget, $20 penalty. Forgot to use a coupon, $10 penalty. Bought coffee without permission. $15 penalty. My hands started shaking when I saw it, but I walked Patricia through every entry, showed her that none of it was legally binding, helped her understand that she didn't owe him anything. She cried with relief. So did I after she left. I called Dr. Kim and told her I didn't know if I could do this job, if I could handle seeing the ledger system replicated in other people's lives. Dr. Kim reminded me that I was uniquely qualified to help because I understood it from the inside. You survived, she said. Now, you help others survive. I stayed with the job. I accessed my trust fund when I turned 21. The $180,000 my parents had been forced to pay sat in an account with my name on it, money extracted from the people who'd tortured me for 10 years. My first instinct was to give it all away, to donate it to abuse prevention organizations and distance myself from anything my parents had touched. But Mr. Kowalski talked me through it. That money represents justice, he said. The court determined you deserved compensation for what was done to you. Don't let them take that away too. I compromised. I donated $80,000 to organizations helping kids escape financial abuse. I used $50,000 as a down payment on a small house where I'd never calculate the cost of existing. I invested the rest for the future. Spending money from the restitution fund felt like an act of defiance, proof that the debt had always been fake, and I'd won. Melanie grew up strong and adjusted remarkably well. She went to college for elementary education and became a teacher, working with young kids who made constant mistakes without fear. She never raised her voice when they spilled paint or forgot homework. Mistakes are how we learn, she'd tell them, the same words Mrs. Kowalski had taught us. She got married at 25 to a kind man who knew her full history and loved her anyway. At her wedding, she asked me to walk her down the aisle since we had no father to do it. I cried through the entire ceremony, watching my little sister build a life our parents had tried to prevent. During her speech at the reception, she thanked the Kowalskis for showing her what real parents looked like. She didn't mention our biological parents at all. They'd been erased from her life so completely, it was like they'd never existed. I got married at 28 to a woman named Rachel, who worked as a therapist specializing in trauma. We'd met at a conference on family systems and abuse. She knew my story before we started dating, had actually read my published thesis, and understood the ledger scars in ways most people couldn't. We talked about having children eventually, about what kind of parents we'd want to be. No ledgers, I said, half joking. No ledgers, she agreed seriously. Just love and patience and accepting that kids are messy. When our daughter was born 2 years later, I held her in the hospital and made a promise. She would never owe me anything for existing. She would make thousands of mistakes, and each one would be met with guidance and patience, not calculation and punishment. She would grow up knowing her worth wasn't measured in dollars or perfection, that she was valuable because she was human. The generational debt my father had tried to create ended with me. I kept the red ledger for 15 years after the trial, stored in a box in my closet as evidence of something, though I was never sure what. Maybe proof that it had really happened. Maybe a reminder of what I'd survived. Maybe insurance in case my parents ever tried to rewrite history. But on my 35th birthday, I decided I didn't need it anymore. I built a fire in my backyard and brought out the ledger. Rachel stood beside me, our daughter asleep inside the house. "Are you sure?" Rachel asked. I opened to the first page and saw my name in my father's handwriting, the first entry about spilled juice, the beginning of 10 years of systematic abuse. I threw it in the fire and watched it burn. Every page curled and blackened, every entry disappearing into ash. 10 years of mistakes calculated at $50 each, a debt that had never been real, reduced to smoke. "How does it feel?" Rachel asked. I watched the last page catch fire. "Like graduation," I said. The ledger had been my prison, and paradoxically my education, teaching me what abuse looked like wrapped in the language of discipline and responsibility. I'd survived it, escaped it, built a career helping others recognize and escape similar systems. The debt was paid not in money, but in years of healing and building something better. The last ember died, and I walked back inside to my family, to a home where mistakes were expected, and love was unconditional, and no one kept score. Finally, completely, I was free. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.